Hi guys. I wanted to get on here tonight because I had an idea that was inspired by watching a Joe Rogan podcast, and he was speaking. I believe it was Joe Rogan speaking with uh, Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins is a famous uh, atheist, and I believe he would also be considered an anti-theist. So when it comes to being an atheist, you find atheists who are a bit more docile, and you come across atheists who are, well, take their atheism to the extreme of anti-theism. So it's really a very clever way of characterizing a very specific type of atheism. But in this conversation with Joe Rogan, he was talking about a popular Joe was talking about a popular criticism of Richard Dawkins' way of thinking, which is that it takes complex phenomena, spiritual, metaphysical phenomena, and reduce them, or through a process of cognitive or intellectual reductionism, reduce them to reduce them to simplicity in a overly reductionist fashion. And that one popular criticism of Richard Dawkins is that he he's overly reductionist in his approach to the world and his approach to culture and existential thought. And a lot of uh, famous scientists, modern thinkers in the league, in the same school as Richard Dawkins, are criticized for being overly reductionist. And one thing that Richard Dawkins notes in this criticism is that there's nothing wrong with reductionism, and that ultimately all empiricism, all scientific empiricism, and all sense based examination of the world relies on a kind of reductionism, and that reductionism, the reduction of complexity into simplicity, is a kind of is a value, and that all scientific discovery has in some way depended upon reductionism to a certain extent, to the extent that empiricism can be equated with reductionism, and or at least involves a kind of reductionism, and that science involves a kind of reductionism to pure facts that can be derived through sensory experience and rational examination. And I think that his point is very good. His point about reductionism is very good. And one thing I did notice is that a lot of people will take reductionism and sort of, oh, reductionism, oh, it's not to be taken seriously. And in a sense, that very attitude is a paradox, because simply dismissing reductionism in that way amounts to a kind of reductionism, that kind of anti-reductionism is very reductionist. It oversimplifies reductionism, and it dismisses the potential value of reductionism in our attempt to understand the physical universe and metaphysical truth. And so, in this way, oftentimes anti reductionism becomes very reductionist unconsciously, and it creates a kind of a paradox, an unfortunate paradox, where the dismissal of reductionism, the kind of cavalier hand waving away of reductionism, is a kind of reductionism of in itself, and it's a reductionism of reductionism. It reduces and dismisses and oversimplifies reductionism. It reduces reductionism. And in that sense, anti-reductionism often becomes very reductionist. And in this way, by pointing out the basic paradox inherent in the attitude of anti-reductionism, anti-reductionists are revealed to be reductionist, even in their thinking about reductionism. And so it's very important that Richard Dawkins' point about reductionism be taken in stride, and that it be taken with, perhaps with a grain of salt, but ultimately we should begin to realize that in some sense what underlies all empiricism and all scientific empiricism and all empirical scientific investigation is a kind of reductionism, and that the human tendency, right? We can either face complexity with awe and confusion, or we can face complexity by reducing it to its component variables and then understanding the interrelationships between the variables and between the component parts. And in this sense, come to understand and reduce complexity to simplicity so that complex phenomena can be made understandable. And if we so cavalierly dismissed reductionism in this way, we would forget its value to scientific empiricism. And so Richard Dawkins' point about reductionism being valuable is a basic recognition that that what underlies scientific empiricism, which we would regard as good, is a kind of reductionism. Hence, we can't outright dismiss reductionism in a reductionist fashion if we're to remain consistent with the thinking and the attitude that reductionism is a bad thing. And so it's very important for people that are investigating the universe and are getting into philosophy to recognize that often the anti-reductionist attitude is very reductionist of reductionism itself, and that reductionism does have value to scientific empiricism and to empirical investigation of the universe, and that it's important for us to be keen to the paradoxes in our own thinking, and especially in the oppositional attitudes to our creeds of thought that unconsciously contradict themselves and wind themselves up into a kind of contradiction or paradox. So, in this sense, often it's only to state that those who cavalierly dismiss reductionism, and in that sense are anti-reductionist, end up being very reductionist of reductionism. And it's a basic paradox in their way of thinking. So I would, in this video, pose the idea that oftentimes anti-reductionism becomes very reductionist, and that to a certain extent, reductionism has value in the realm of scientific empiricism, so that humans can take complex phenomena and not to look at them with awe or confusion, or to accept that they're totally not capable of being understood, but rather to face complex phenomena with an intelligent reductionist framework of thinking that then allows us to reduce complex phenomena to their constituent variable parts, and then understand the interrelationships between the variables and the scientific laws that govern the variables, and in that sense come to understand them in a scientifically empirical way. So it's important to note that in some sense, if we are to engage in empirical thinking, we have to accept a certain level of reductionism. And that oftentimes those who are anti-reductionist and sort of hand wave away reductionism are often being very reductionist in their anti-reductionism. And so that's really the only point that I wanted to make. But I can link in the video, the information on the video, the Joe Rogan podcast that I'm talking about, or at least the clip that I'm talking about, where Richard Dawkins discusses the value of reductionism. And I quote, "There's nothing wrong with reductionism." Right? Because as I see it, reductionism is necessary to scientific empiricism. And that's really the only point that I wanted to make. Thank you for watching.